The Marinade.
There's no O in Marinade. Let's try it one more time. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
The Marinade.
Marinade.
Bone marinade. The
That's
Marinade.
The Marinade. With Jason Earle.
I've been all around the world, and guess what? It's all the same. You could see it all from the window of the plane. And I've had so many flings, and been burned by so many flames. Guess what? A twin bed is plenty of space at the end of the
Welcome
day.
to The Marinade, a free-flowing conversation about the creative process with creative people. This is episode 138, and our guest is Jesse Daniel Edwards. Jesse's a songwriter from California who now makes his home in Nashville. His latest record is called Violensia, and it is, as you will hear in this episode, a wild and wonderful ride. Edwards has lived an incredible life. He's gone from growing up without television or internet to leaving home at 16 to tour managing the likes of Jason Isbell, Lucinda Williams, and Morrissey, and in the meantime making these unique and fascinating records. This is a far-reaching conversation that dives into inspiration and process and helps make sense of life's major decisions. Everyone, it is my great honor to present my conversation with Jesse Daniel Edwards.
I'm so happy I think I might cry. I've got a good coat for my chills, and a good girl for my thrills, and a very good excuse for my ills. And I've got almost too much
Hey, man.
time. How are you?
I'm doing quite well, thank you. How are you?
Good. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
Dude, thank you so much for doing this. Your record is such a wild ride, and I am so excited to dig into it with you.
Thank you very much. I agree. It's still kind of a wild ride for me to listen to it.
I've been driving around with it. I always burn a CD once I get these records from, publicists, and I give it a shot. I burn a CD, I listen to it once. If it grabs me, I listen to it again. With yours, it was instant. And I was just like, oh shit. Yeah, I got to talk to this guy. This is going to be a lot of fun. So thank you so much. Thank you for the record. And thank you so much for taking the time. Man,
Thanks for listening.
yeah, for sure. And for folks listening to this, like, make sure you it's out now. So by the time folks hear this, they'll, they can go out and get it if they haven't already, and just can't say enough about it. I want to talk about the record, but dude, you've lived such a life. So I'd also like to talk about your life a little bit leading up to the record if we can. And I think, I talk a lot about religion on this show just because of my own upbringing and the trauma I have from it. And it's the timing of this conversation, I think, is important for me selfishly, because I just had this experience yesterday where, as my day job, I'm a middle school and high school educator. And I'm kind of in between, careers right now. I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, shit is wild here in Florida, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I actually entertained the idea of working for a religious school, Christian school specifically, that's new and, not something that I normally would be okay with. Like, normally but there was something about these guys. I was like, they don't seem that bad. They seem open-minded, and then they were talking about God as love and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, man, yeah, I can dig that. Like, I can get behind all of this. And then I went back for a second interview. And during the second interview, then the misogyny came out. Then the bigotry came out. Then the stuff that like really fucked me up about growing up in the church started to come out. And it's just, I felt like I had made progress, and then I just backslid back in that progress. So when I was, getting ready for this conversation, I was like, I'm not going to talk too much about religion. not going to talk too much about religion. And then that happened to me yesterday. So I really want to talk about your upbringing and then sort of like your relationship with religion and spirituality and so forth.
Wow, yeah, that sounds great. And I'm an open book, as per your shirt. Very good shirt. Where are you in
Thank
Florida?
you. I'm in Orlando.
Okay, yeah, I was just talking to a friend about where she was going through blood samples for the pulse shooting, if you recall that.
Oh,
And,
unfortunately, I remember it all too well. I remember the sound of the sirens.
yeah, but she worked in a lab doing blood samples to help some of the survivors and some of the injured from that occurrence. And she also is a sole survivor. And I think being in the South, there are a lot of people like that, like yourself, that have come through a church upbringing and have gotten to the other side of that, loss of faith, becoming certainly disillusioned, but then also still very much seeking that essence of faith and maybe that spiritual life. And there aren't a lot of answers in this part of the world for those people. And so I was talking to her about, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was some sort of outreach to sort of bring these people into sort of fold and to care for these people and to help them transition to, let's face it, real life. So yeah, I would love to certainly talk about that or whatever's on your mind or heart to discuss.
Yeah, well, I'm interested in your upbringing in California. And like one of the things that I was thinking about as I was doing the research for this conversation is, while I grew up in the church, I had access to popular music and books and TV and all that, and films. I mean, my dad was taking me to like even like PG-13 and R-rated films at a fairly young age. Like I was exposed culture-wise to plenty. Now, what I'm interested in, because I think that it impacted how I processed faith and religion, right? I think it brought me to a place of doubt quicker than I may have if I didn't have access to some of those things. I'm curious about like your headspace when you don't have access to those things and you're a kid and you're very clearly a creative person who had to have at least some innate sense of that creativity at a young age. Like what was in your head at the time growing up?
Well, I think we had a lot of the same questions that anybody would have, especially in adolescence, as you start to attempt to establish your own independence and you start to try to learn to think for yourself and you start to try to envision a larger horizon, a larger world than maybe the one in which you've been raised. I think that popular music, modern music, certainly film, novels, books, documentaries, anything like that is very helpful in assisting with that sort of coming of age. I grew up sort of creating and living in a bubble, along with my siblings. And so we didn't really have that outside influence. We didn't have any sort of backdrop or sense of context, but we still had the same impetus and we still had the same sort of unrest and that same sort of sense of internal driving outward. But I think, to help, deal and confront with, deal with and confront those urges and instincts, we sort of had to, reinvent the wheel 1,000 times over. So we were kind of, using what was at hand, which was just some hand-me-down instruments from my grandparents. And we had a lot of classical music. We had some hymnal music. We had a lot of classical literature. And so I think we were digging a lot deeper and a lot more aggressively than maybe we would have if we had Bob Dylan, or if we had even the Beatles, or if we had even proto-punk music or a PG-13 movie. So I think a lot of it was just sort of guesswork. A lot of it was taking place in the dark. And then when I left home at 16 and actually was able to get my hands on some of these materials in real life, it was severely overwhelming, and I didn't really know where to begin, but I also had just an insatiable appetite to absorb as much of it as I could. And I don't think it was until maybe 10, 15 years after that I finally reached a sense of stasis where it was like, okay, let's throttle it back to just cruising altitude now. We don't have to try to soak up everything every single second. But I did it did catapult me into just sort of diving the deep end for a long time, which I think is a big part of the frantic sound of what I was doing. Even back then, I was listening to some early demos, and it's not that dissimilar from Violensia or from stuff I've done since. It's just there's an aggression there that's just it's kind of just the pace that's demanded by needing to kind of get caught up.
Oh wow, that's there's a lot there. Okay, so what are like the what is the subject matter and what are the themes of the music you were making as a kid with your family?
Yeah, a lot of it was kind of to harken back to what I was alluding to earlier. A lot of it was dealing with certainly trying to find my way out of this little community. It was trying to tackle bigger philosophical ideas that I had no inclination. I mean, what that might be. I mean, I was asking big questions, but without any sort of framework. I hadn't really been exposed to any philosophical writers at that point yet. I had read through a lot of the classics, but humanist ideas, I mean, were pretty foreign to me. So it was a lot of questioning, and certainly a lot of trying to make sense of the spiritual disparity. We grew up, my dad was very religious, very militaristic. He was a military guy. So strict household, and trying to make sense of that, but then also all these other things that were going on mentally and spiritually that I didn't really have a name for yet. And so it was just kind of a lot of raw, sort of unfiltered questioning of everything, and things that I was even daring to tackle things, like my own sexuality, or, what happens when we die, things like that, at the time I felt very emboldened by being able to ask the question, because it was everything was pretty taboo to us growing up. I mean, we couldn't talk about anything. So being able to think about it, and even just individually in the privacy of my own creation with the piano or the guitar, it was kind of an act of rebellion, or it felt that way to me. But it also felt acceptable. I finally had discovered an outlet where it could exist for the first time ever. I mean, I was very quiet as a child. All of us were, my 6 siblings and myself, and just simply because we weren't really able to talk about anything. So finally, here was a way to not only think about it, not only discuss it and put it out there, even albeit sort of a one-sided conversation, but I was kind of shouting it out, at top volume, and no one seemed to be. I didn't seem to be getting into any trouble for it.
Okay, that's interesting, because you mentioned your father being militaristic and religious, and so I was curious about that. Like, was he encouraging this creation? Was he just kind of condoning it? Like, what was that relationship like in terms of you're making this kind of these acts of rebellion, essentially? Was he seeing it that way?
Well, conveniently, he wasn't really there for the early years. So by the time he came into the family fold after some pretty active deployments for most of my childhood, I was already sort of in an advanced state of rebellion, and so it was kind of that was a big reason, I think, why I left home so early. We just couldn't see eye to eye. We just had a very difficult relationship back then. My mother was the one that raised us for most of childhood. My dad was certainly supportive financially. He was in between deployments. He certainly made an effort, but I didn't really come to know my dad until my mother passed away, and until we had all gotten a lot older. I think it was difficult for him talking to children. I don't think he knew really what to say to us, and there were certainly so many of us, and he only really knew how to manage troops. And so since there was such a large group of us, I think he just applied the same MO to keeping order in the household when he was home. And then when he was gone, it would sort of return to this other equilibrium that we had with my mom, who was very creative, was not religious, but was sort of quasi-spiritual, maybe, some sort of modern agnostic in a sense. And she was very encouraging of whatever we would do, and very in any sort of artistic or creative endeavor, she was very, she very much believed in that. And so, and I was also kind of protective of my lyrics. I would play the music, but I would sort of write the lyrics down, and I would have outlets at school, when I bring my guitar to school, or at talent shows, or with my first little middle school band. But I don't know if they ever heard any of the lyrics until I was much older. And by then I had some ammunition. I'd gotten into punk music. I had made some demos. I'd returned back home. So I think it was a little bit more fully formed. But my dad certainly came around when we all got older, as I mentioned. And I think, he came to see me in Mobile on a recent tour, maybe 2 months ago, and he was in tears. And these are all songs that are very anti-gun violence. They're very anti-war. They're very anti-organized religion. They're very much calling out by name. Some of this isn't on Violensia, but they're very much calling out by name, like the fentanyl crisis. Things that you don't necessarily hear in maybe more comfortable sounding music, stuff that's not really fun to talk about in any circumstance. But he came up to me, and he just brought me into a big embrace, and he was just saying, whatever you've done, you finally figured out, how to say what's on your heart, and to talk about things that are difficult, and thank you for doing what you do.
Wow.
And he was just in tears, but it's a story arc that's taken 3 decades to get to that place where a father and son can have that conversation. But, it's not lost on me that early sort of quiet rebellion growing up, and sort of the resistance that he provided. I mean, that's probably a pretty formative part of how we all ended up here.
Man, I'm so happy for you that you had that moment. I mean, that story so often doesn't end, or doesn't have that kind of a resolution, right? So often it has quite the opposite resolution, or it never has a moment, it just kind of goes away. For you to have that with your father, that's so beautiful. And it illustrates the power of music, right? And the beauty of music, and its ability to bridge gaps, its ability to bring people together. That's a big gap. And for your father to see the beauty in it, and it speaks not only to the work that you've done, but also to just like the greater beauty and power of music. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you. Yeah, it does feel sort of like a minor miracle, at least in my relationship within family. So it's I'm very, very grateful. Very grateful.
That's awesome, man. Okay, so I'm really interested. I've always been interested in busking culture in general. One of these days I'm going to do this, where I'm going to do a podcast series where I talk to people who busk and put it all together. And I don't know what that story looks like, but I've had this idea bouncing around for like 6 years, where I really want to. Every time I see somebody busking, which doesn't happen much in Florida, we don't have much of that culture. In some places, it's not legal and that kind of thing. In Orlando, it's kind of a gray area in terms of its legality. And so you don't see much of it. Jacksonville, you'll see a little bit of it. But we don't get it as much here as some places. But I am fascinated by busking. And I'm also fascinated by the fact that you left home at 16. That sounds terrifying to me. Right. Like if I think back on my life, I wasn't even close to emotionally mature enough to go out of my home, like what was that feeling like once you made the decision? You touched on why you made the decision. What was the feeling like when you made that decision, and like, how did you get by? What were you doing?
Well, I was in school, so I left high school early and went straight into college at 16. And I remember walking out of my little small town high school. I was 15 and a half when I left, and I had tested out of high school, and part of the final, I don't really even know why it was required, but you had to go around, at least I did. I had to go around to each of my classes and get signed out for the last time. So it was like in the middle of the morning, and I just went around to my teacher and I had them sign me out, and they had no idea. They just said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, I'm done. I'm leaving." And I had an official little transcript, and I remember I had my physics teacher. He he looked up and he kind of had failing eyesight, and which we exploited and made great use of in the back. But he kept looking at me, and I think it was the first time he actually saw me. Up until then, I had just been sort of, part of the general background noise. But, by taking a stand, I was finally being noticed as a human being, and that stuck with me. But when I started school, and I immediately dove right into philosophy and world religion, and just trying to get some of those bigger questions finally, answered and dealt with. But of course, it only left me with more questions. So in any case, I was in school. I had a scholarship, so I was pretty okay. I was doing okay. It was kind of an easy transition in that regard, because I still had some structure. I hadn't started busking yet. A lot of my siblings left home around the same age, and it was just the feeling of kind of just. And it wasn't that we were unloved. It wasn't that it was so difficult. I mean, everyone you talk to has had difficulty, and in this society, in this country, in Western culture, we have our own sort of laundry list of despairs. I mean, especially growing up, and especially as widespread as the Judeo-Christian influences within our society, and especially with the broken home thing that was going on in the 90s, like where the divorce rate finally surpassed the marriage rate, and it was, everyone was coming from a broken home. Everyone was messing around with whatever drugs, which were becoming very easy to get in pill form, especially in a small town where I grew up. Everyone was hooked on video games. Columbine had just happened. Everyone was disillusioned. Everyone, I think, in where I grew up, sensed just the fabric coming apart, of whatever order. The music reflected it. The movies reflected it. So everyone has stories of woe, and I've been to other countries where people are living in piles of garbage, or people are fighting off rats for the carcass of a dead dog in the street to eat, and it's a different category of hardship. But I mean, Americans, especially in the middle class, especially of a certain generation, I mean, I think everyone I talk to, has stories as weird or as difficult as mine. I mean, yes, we grew up without the internet or without, video games and stuff like that. But, I think the one thing that made us different, I think, was, we had such a big family, which is always a rarity, in modern times. I think it's even more rare now. So I think that was really the big motivator. There were so many of us, it just felt crowded. I think a lot, there's just a sense of needing to drive outward, not from a place of untoward angst or complete dissatisfaction. I mean, certainly there were elements of restlessness, but I really think it was just, we felt we could, and we felt it was needed. Our parents gave it their blessing in so much as they could. Both of my sisters left home at that age. My sister Christina left home at 16 and just moved down the street from the family home and was living in an apartment by the railroad tracks. And my other sister Olivia, who was 13, just went to live with her. So that was, if that gives you any sort of idea. But it was just, I think for me it was, I wanted to get started. I was so bored in school. I hated every moment of it, and I just wanted to get started with living my life and just seeing what was out there. I couldn't even help it. It felt like a foregone conclusion that I would just immediately get started doing whatever I needed to do.
That's really interesting. So did you think then, like at that point, did you think I'm going to make music, like a life out of music?
I didn't even know enough to even consider the possibility. I mean, I didn't have the internet,
Yeah.
Even when we had the internet I guess we got the internet when I was 15. So, but it was the dial-up thing. We lived in the mountains. I mean, it was useless, I mean,
Yeah.
And that was also the early days of the internet. It wasn't like you just pulled up YouTube and had everything at your fingertips. Back then, my favorite website was this website it was like this homemade affair, like a lot of the web was back then. And it was devoted to how Britney Spears was a covert government operative sent out into the public to brainwash society. And I religiously followed this website.
Oh my gosh.
But that was about all that you could do with the internet.
Yeah.
It was even before chat rooms and forums. So all I would do is I would just read these these paragraphs that someone had written about how they thought that Britney Spears was a government agent. But that was the so
Yeah.
there wasn't any information basically of much value. I mean, I thought it was valuable at the time. When I was 14, 15, I just was like, oh my God, this is yes, this makes total sense. But I think it occurred to I've been a late bloomer in just about everything. It didn't occur to me. I've always just had music around. I've always played music. My first memory is I'm playing the piano. It's been my it's how it's in the same way that I brush my teeth or I eat, or it's as natural as breathing. It's just always something that's been around my life. I don't even view it as me doing it. I feel like I'm just sort of hooking into it, but it's always around. It's just hovering in the room. So, and I've always had sort of a poetic approach with, the music being very separate from the lyrics, but always being sort of able to dance around both. But turning it into a lifestyle or a career in a larger sense, I mean, when I was in school, when I was in college at 16, I was so obsessed with philosophy, but I was still writing music and writing poetry. But you could definitely see the philosophical bent that was sort of winding its way into it. It's kind of just my lifelong journal, but turning that into anything beside that, I mean, it never even occurred to me to how to get a band going, how to get gigs, how to get a set list, how to even really sing or get on a stage. I mean, I was so far away from figuring that out. It hadn't even crossed my mind, which is how I ended up busking in the first place, was because it just seemed like the only logical way to actually go out and do anything with all of the music that had sort of accrued over from say 16 to 19. It didn't occur to me to try to, well, and even then it wasn't necessarily, you weren't sending emails to clubs to get booked. I mean, back then it was still kind of like you had to have an in, you had to call, you had to show up at the club, you had to do the open mic thing. Maybe you had a friend that could get you on a bill. I mean, but that was, so I just started busking because just kind of like moving out, it had to come out. I had to go do something. And it wasn't maybe the most elegant solution. It maybe wasn't the most sensible, certainly not the most lucrative or sustainable, but it was something I could immediately do. And, so I think, kind of by a peripheral approach, which I think is how most things have happened to me. It wasn't until I had sort of a philosophical burnout and an existential crisis, from just being too young in college and just throwing myself in the deep end. It wasn't until I had just completely washed out of that trajectory that I had put myself on that I started to look at, okay, well, music. I mean, and I was in Florida, actually. I was at a place called, what was the name of that place? It was in Pensacola, Florida. It was a DIY vegan spot. And I mean, everyone from Jonathan Richman to P-Lander Z had played this little dive bar spot. I don't even know if these places like this even still exist. I think there are little pigeonholes on the internet where these people find an outlet. But back then, I mean, that was the only place you got to see it, But I saw a band that was on tour. I mean, it didn't even seem like a tour. It just seems like they were living out of the van and they just loaded in. And I was 19. I was 18 or 19. I was just sort of bumming around and I saw it. And it was only then that I thought, hey, I do music. I could do something kind of like this. And I don't know why I didn't think about it before.
Oh,
But
wow.
I think it was just because information was it just wasn't forthcoming back then. And I wasn't part of any scene. I didn't know anything about cool music. So I think I was just way out. My orbit was just way out. So it didn't occur to me until much later. And I had to first, be broken in so many ways existentially to finally kind of look at music as maybe something more than just my own private journal, I guess.
So fascinating. What year is that when you're 19 and you have that realization?
That would have been, let's see, I think it was around when I saw that, 2001, 2 maybe.
Okay. All right. So you're like just a couple years younger than me, it sounds like. So
maybe 03, I guess, by the math.
Okay.
02, 03.
Okay. So because I can see, I wasn't in music then, but like I could see that, I can see that scene so well that you're describing, right?
Yeah.
Like I was just a fan, but like I can put myself in that place, so well. all right. So how do you get from there to tour managing the likes of Morrissey and Jason Isbell and Lucinda Williams? Like, is that later? Is that around the same time? Like, how does this happen?
It's quite a bit later after kind of doing music and not really knowing how to get shows, so busking, and then eventually, nothing happens in a straight line when you're trying to figure things out. It's kind of, there's a year where it's just, you're surfing and bar backing at your friend's bar, or there's, a whole year like that, or a year where you're crashing on your brother's friend's grandma's couch, so there was a lot of that. All the while I was writing, but I mean, not very prolifically and not very intentionally. Occasionally ideas would come up. It was before I'd moved to Nashville, and I hadn't really learned about discipline or professionalism, about songwriting. I was just sort of letting it come out, stream of consciousness. I didn't even own any instruments, whatever was around, I'd pick it up. I was always writing in my journal or doing poetry. But eventually, my brother and I had enough songs, and we had met a friend in California who was kind of the inverse of us. He had a very deep understanding of a lot of classic music, and was a great musician, great singer. So he was able to kind of complete our little trio, and we just took that little busking show on the road, and we basically got in this 1974 VW bus that my mom had loaned us, and we, for the express purpose of this trip to Nashville, to go and busk and just, when you're 20 years old, you have that kind of freedom. So we just went, and we never came back. We just kept on going. Eventually we ran out of money. Eventually it just all fell apart. Our collaborator just kind of left. It just hit bottom, and he just left. And my brother and I eventually went our separate ways. And I just have sort of kept going and trying to figure it out, as I've gone along. And Nashville, the story certainly wouldn't be complete without giving Nashville its due. That's where I am even as we speak. It's been a pretty important place for me, and I don't know why certain places are more important than others. Maybe it's geological, maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's culture, microcultures. But Nashville's a pretty unique place, and back then it was still kind of gritty. It was very bohemian. So when we busked through, because when we were busking around California, people always would say, "Hey, you guys got to go to Nashville. You guys sound like Nashville," because we had acoustic instruments and 3-part harmony. It was kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. It was kind of folky, but it was the Americana designation came along much later. I think that was sort of invented it was just sort of an invention of the music industry, more or less. But back then it was kind of folky. So eventually we busked our way to Nashville. And of course, as soon as we started busking here, everyone here was, they just said, "Oh, you guys sound so West Coast. You sound so California." So we were sort of caught in a cultural identity crisis. But for some reason, it stuck with me because of how bohemian it was, and because it was a music town. It was kind of like if saying you really liked, I don't know what's a good example. It's saying you really love basketball, and it's like there's just a town that's just big enough where everything revolves around basketball. It's not a hobby. Everything revolves around this one thing. So I'd never seen anything like that. And I had fallen in love with the South because of just the soul, I've always been sort of craving that soul element, and the South has it.
Mm-hmm.
Nashville, I think, has lost a lot of it as it's become more gentrified and more popular. Ironically, it's a lot of Californians moving out here who, "Oh, we love Nashville." And as soon as they get here, this is in recent times, kind of COVID on, as soon as they get here, they want to change it and make it like LA. So it's sort of lost a little bit, actually.
That's interesting.
See, that way, it kind of, okay, this is a very familiar cultural identity crisis again. But so I always tried to get back here. And after so many years, I eventually did make it back here. And the songwriter John Prine, his manager Al Bonetta, took me under his wing. He saw us busking, my brother and I, and he kind of kept track of me, kind of had taken me under his wing. He was the first mentor that I'd ever had. And I always felt a little suspicious and guilty because he would give me so much and he would speak into my life. And I always felt like, what am I doing to deserve this? You know, maybe it's that Judeo-Christian sense of guilt or transactional sort of generosity. But he just really just no questions asked, just kind of helped me become a songwriter. And he did everything from put me up in songwriting sessions down on Music Row. He had me meet with, I mean, he knew everybody. He had the keys to the city. So he just put me in rooms with all these people. And I was too young and too inexperienced and too unrefined to really do anything with it at the time. But it certainly planted the seeds and shaped me for what I would become. I don't think if he saw me now, I don't think he would know what to make of me. He's since passed. But I took everything from that and just applied it in a different way. But in any case, when he did pass, I came out here. One of his last requests was that I perform at his memorial. So I came out here, and I hadn't been doing music at that point. I was working at an outdoor education camp in the mountains, in a town of like 300 people. But I dusted the guitar off. I came out. I performed at his memorial one song, and his memorial, it was kind of like it was a who's who of just famous Nashville movers and shakers, country stars, old school famous managers from the 80s, record label presidents, all that kind of thing. And so I was kind of doing the rounds, talking to everybody, and I was kind of, oh wow, Nashville, yeah, I haven't been here in ages. Wow, I almost moved here. Wow, my life could have been so different. But I'm happy where I'm working in the mountains. I met Morrissey's then tour manager, who was a guy that I had also met busking here in like 2007 maybe. And he just approached me and he said, hey, let's catch up. Let's get some dinner. We got dinner. He said, hey, what are you doing in 2 weeks? Do you think you could come out to Sydney, Australia, and just help me on this Morrissey gig? The guy that was in that position, we had to fire suddenly because he put the band on the wrong train in Spain on a tour. And so they were late for the gig, and we just fired him on the spot. I said, whoa, okay. First of all,
holy shit.
First of all, okay, not a great intro to how stressful this might be. Second of all, I don't know anything about this job. Third, I'm committed to this camp gig. I mean, summer, the session is just around the corner. At that point, I was like the associate director of the camp.
Yeah.
So, we had a few drinks. I thought we're just kind of spitballing. Fly back home. He sends me a formal offer. I talked to the director, who's a friend of mine, an Australian guy who I lived with. I said, man, because he was asking, he's like, how was it? Was it kind of intense? Your mentor and being back. And I was like, yeah, it was. And, I just got to share, this happened. I met this guy, and I guess he really wants me to go to Sydney. And as I mentioned, the director was Australian. And he was like, what? I was like, yeah, it's totally crazy. He wants me to go and just help him out, like tour managing this band Morrissey and everything. I was like, oh, you from the Smiths? I was like, I guess. He's like, let me see the offer. So we're looking at the offer, and he says, you got to go. And I was like, what? I was like, we're about to start. He's like, you just got to go. We can
wait. I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is an amazing story, but you weren't really familiar with Morrissey at this point?
Man, I still to this day am not familiar on things that are pretty obvious because because there was such a deficit of exposure to music and to art and culture by default. When I kind of went out and just plowed my own sort of course, I keep in mind it was, again, no internet. There wasn't Spotify, nothing. So I would discover stuff from, like when I lived in DC, I was living in this religious community for a year. I kind of followed this girl out there. And so there was this Brazilian bookshop. It was the one spot I could get to on a bike from this kind of really remote religious community. But it was all like Brazilian books and music. So I got really into Brazilian samba for a while. There was I don't know what agency was guiding me, if any, but it was very hard to find stuff. And also music was expensive back then. It's something else that, talking to people nowadays, it's like, music is free and it's so widely available, and there's so many interesting and fun ways to discover music. This podcast is a fine example. I'm not talking about algorithmically generated. I'm not a big believer, in the machine reality and algorithms. I just, as I mentioned before, in search of soul and soul elements, that's just the opposite. I don't want to go on a tirade about that, but
Yeah.
it's just not for me. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Nowadays, there's so many great ways to discover music. When I was discovering music, which was kind of the window from maybe 16 to 26, a good solid decade.
Yeah.
And then I sort of I feel like I sort of calcified a little bit. And then I also kind of let myself off the hook because I realized there are decades, every 7-10 years, the music trends drastically change. And there's always undercurrents and little niche things. But I gave myself grace. I was like, if the music trends suck, then give yourself 10 years off and just go listen to the music you listened to in early college and wait for the trends to get cool again. And so I've done that a couple times already. I mean, when I kind of missed the whole emo thing, and it's kind of like, I just kind of like took a break from new music for while that was going on.
Yeah.
And now I can go back and I can discover some things I like about emo, but I was like, I had really gotten into punk and like post-hardcore and hardcore and like some kind of metal. And I was like, when I saw the emo thing coming on, and especially when it got popular, I'm such a contrarian, I think I was just raised that way. My parents really wanted us to think for ourselves and be independent thinkers. And what that means is you're questioning everything all the time, and it's hard to turn that off. So you become sort of just a contrarian to everything automatically. Hey, do you like this? It's a really amazing cheesecake. Well, is it? I don't know. I've had some pretty good cheesecake. It's like, yes, it's a good cheesecake.
Dude, I can so relate to that. Hey, real quick, because
it was hard to find music.
Zoom's about to cut us off because we don't pay for it. Do you mind clicking on the same link if you've still got time? Because this is so wonderful. This is a blast.
Yeah.
Good. When it kicks us off, if we'll just click the same link and we'll just keep going. Okay.
Hello again,
dude. Thank you. As I always do at this point, I want to remind our Patreon, our folks listening, that we have a Patreon, and if you join it, maybe I can pay for Zoom and not have to do this every time. So patreon.com/Marinade podcast, everybody, just as little as $2 a month, and you get a Patreon exclusive content. And maybe I'll get to pay for Zoom one day and not have to ask our guests to re-click on the link. So, okay. So I kind of interrupted your story because I was so fascinated by that. And it's so interesting to me that your musical education, so to speak, kind of it was so non-traditional, right? So, whereas
uncharted. Yeah. So I didn't discover, I still to this day, there'll be just sort of gaping holes of things that might be pretty obvious for just about everybody else. And so I'm still trying to cover some ground. For sure.
Yeah. Okay, so you get that offer to go to Australia. The director of the camp is like, dude, you got to do this. It's Morrissey.
Right.
Like, so then you go. What is that experience? Because the other thing, this probably served you well, I guess, your lack of knowledge about it, because Morrissey's got a reputation of being like pretty difficult to deal with, So I wonder if you had known that, if that would have affected your decision, especially after you told that story about the guy getting fired for that one mistake. It's really interesting to me, like, that your sort of, maybe lack of knowledge at that time may have impacted your decision, whether or not to go.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. And I didn't know anything about him or I think, to put it into perspective, at that time I was listening to my roommate, the Australian camp director, he was really into metal. So, I mean, we were going to see like Mastodon. I mean, I was just sort of in that world, I was really into Faith No More at that time. I remember. So I didn't know anything about Morrissey or the Smiths. I hadn't really gone in that direction yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it probably would have, but I was young enough where I was still kind of really open to whatever. And I don't think I was afraid of being super stressed out, or afraid of being challenged. Maybe, as I've gotten older, it's kind of, I think I'm a little more protective. And I think it's because I threw myself through the ringer, I think, more than most people I know, just for kicks or just for whatever, just for the story. But I think more to the point, my mom had just died. And so, I mean, she died at midnight on New Year's Eve. And then, Al, my mentor, died unexpectedly 3 months after that. So I was and then I got the offer just right on the heels of that. So I was kind of in a weird headspace as it was. I mean, I don't even really remember much about January through March of that year, because I was just sort of, it was the dead of winter in the mountains. I mean, there it was cold and dark, you know, snow would blow under the door jamb. I mean, it was like I kind of was just looking for a lifeline. So this offer came along, and I had the blessing from my friends at the camp. So I just kind of went into it thinking, you know, maybe this will just kind of propel me out of this heavy funk, you know. And I guess in a way it did, you know, in a way it did, but it was very stressful. It was, you know, I thought I was going to get fired every day for the first year. Ended up staying for 5 years, you know.
Oh, wow. That long. I did not realize that.
Yeah, I was
Wow.
there a long time. And the guy that replaced me lasted 12 days. So,
Yeah.
well, that was about 3 years in. And then I was like, hey, I think I'm going to go. I think I want to go try my own hand at music, which is not something that had occurred to me. This harkens back to an earlier question. I've always done music, always loved it. I've been very hesitant about turning it into anything more than that, because oftentimes it can turn into a drag, and it's like you don't want that to happen to something you really love. So I've been very hesitant to ever do more than just do it for myself. But I'd done 3 years. I'd been to 100 and something countries with them, and I mean, there are countries where he gets mobbed by people on the platform of the bullet train, or people camp out in front of his hotel for a week. I mean, it's Beatlemania shit that just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's kind of the last of a generation in that regard. So I had seen so much, and I think I'd healed up enough, or I'd written some songs. So I wanted to give it a shot doing my own thing. I really wanted to move back to Nashville. Well, the guy that they brought in to replace me lasted about 12 days, left in the middle of the night, didn't even take his bag with him. So they called me up and frantically from Sweden and said, hey man, is there any way you can, so I came back in for another 2 years and eventually left, and then and by then I had gotten some chops with tour managing. I'd met enough people where, you know, then I kind of slid into Lucinda Williams camp, and then when COVID hit, Jason Isbell, you know, I started working for him here in town. And you know, I think if it hadn't been for COVID, I probably would have just kept tour managing. You know, it's a comfortable life, it's good money, as opposed to being a starving artist where it's, you know, you're not really making any money. And that's okay. I mean, I've never done anything just for the money, but the tour managing thing was a comfortable gig. I got pretty good at it, or good enough, you know. And, you know, I mean, Lucinda says I'm the best tour manager she's ever had. She's also got a reputation, I think, for, and people say that to me, like, some of these artists, you know, you've worked with some difficult artists, and I don't really think they're difficult. I find normal people to be difficult because the boredom is overwhelming. But I think it's reminiscent of growing up. You know, my mom was probably the first artist I really managed as the eldest sibling. So it was something I was already sort of used to, even though I had to learn about gigs and about production, about tour buses and tour budgets, things like that. But there was something you mentioned that is very much the case. Not knowing anything about these artists allowed me to learn about them in a way that very few people will or can. And it was the way that maybe I needed to, because I was hearing the music of Morrissey through the backstage wall as I was doing shit backstage, or in a conversation as they were eating dinner, or we were on a tour bus together, all of us. And I learned so much from those guys. And his guitar player, Boz Borer, who's kind of a legend in his own right, he was another mentor to me, and they taught me so much about music, but how music really is art, and how that isn't just something you're doing when you're on stage or in the studio or writing. It's something that is a lifestyle. It pervades everything that you do and everything that you are. And I'd never even considered that. So it was it was very much a master class in writing, in how you compose yourself, in touring, in traveling. And obviously, I mean, I think the influence is pretty evident. You know, I mean, you know, the songs on Violensia, I mean, it really stuck with me. You know, what Morrissey does. He's very brilliant, obviously, and just sort of by being in the room, I was able to glean just a lot of what he does and how they are as a band. And that really made an impact on me. And that sort of circle was complete when I worked with Lucinda, because she's like one of the old blues people. And, the terminology is blues men, they're one of the old blues men. But there were so many blues women at the time, but there just wasn't, it was hard enough for, the blues men to find an outlet, but blues women had even less of an outlet. It's only coming out now that there were brilliant, women singers and writers and performers of the blues as well.
Yeah.
So, but she is in that tradition. She is, just her trajectory, and she eventually became friends, and she lives in this neighborhood, but and I don't know if you've read her book, but it's a pretty cool book, just came out. But I always walked around the blues because I knew it kind of wasn't for me. I didn't have any ownership in the blues. It almost felt like to try to do any. So I didn't even sing blues. I didn't even sing like a blues scale. I avoided blues notes because it just felt so not authentic to what I do. So I didn't feel like I could ever even pretend to be part of what the blues represents. She was my gateway into understanding the blues, and she broke it down for me so hard. she introduced me to the writings of like Frank Stanford. We would stay up late into the night on the tour bus drinking red wine, discussing Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers, the Southern Gothic. It went so deep for me, and that was kind of the final rounding of the thing, because Morrissey's doing it in something similar in a very British way, in a way that's kind of very highbrow, in a way that's very philosophical. But the Southern Gothic thing is very street level. It's talking about some really dark, fucked up shit in a way, though, that they're just talking about it in a way that they're finding ways to cope with it and to live with it, which is probably the heartbeat of what the blues represents, in a sense, not non-musically. And then the music reflects it so well, because you have to break all the rules. It has to be something that you can just break down and strip down until there's just the core. And there's always an element too of, if you like Faulkner, there's always an element of almost tongue in cheek sort of, or Mark Twain, certainly, it's like, yes, we're talking about the most miserable elements of our nature. That's how far we've allowed things to be stripped down here in the South. And yet we're finding ways to live, and we're finding ways to laugh. Love is kind of a tortured subject in the blues, which suits me very well. So that's how I ended up with Violensia, was because I was able to just learn at the feet of these. Well, it was just by being in the room, just by being allowed to be in this master class. It was the education that I was really looking for all those years ago in college in philosophy.
Yeah.
And music was able to kind of be the gateway to learning those things that I'd always felt, because my upbringing was very Southern Gothic. It sounds like maybe yours was too. A lot of people,
for sure,
it's so miserable, but there's no way to talk about it. And there's no way to make sense of it. But in the blues or in music, in art, all of a sudden it takes shape in a way that you can understand, in a way you can wrestle with.
Dude, I got chills, and I'm sure people listening to this are going to feel this too, when you're telling the story about staying up with Lucinda Williams on the tour bus, drinking red wine. That is the most romantic scene in my mind. Like talking about life with Lucinda Williams on the tour bus drink. I don't know that it gets any sexier to me. I don't mean like romantically sexy. I mean like romantic on the, sort of as a global idea of romance. That is, what an awesome opportunity. And you mentioned that, like how you're getting this education, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about is Violensia, and how like these characters in these songs are so rich and chaotic. There are messy relationships throughout this thing. It is, and which is, a huge reason why I was so drawn to it. Right. And why I continue to be so drawn to it. But they're so rich and chaotic, but they're so relatable. Like the series of lines in Backyard Party MDA, where he's the narrator saying like, can we pretend I said something more charming instead? Those, and then like there's like 3 iterations of that, different variations of that line. And it's just like, dude, I'm 100% there. I've been that character before. Right. Less and less so as I get older, but, and hopefully wiser and shut my damn mouth more, but I've been there, and most of us have. And I was going to ask you about those, but it sounds like this rich life that you've lived and this access to these folks who are true legends. I mean, Lucinda Williams, Morrissey, and Jason Isbell, Albinetta, these are true giants, right? Legends, people who have had, I didn't even know who Albinetta was, so I started doing this research. And once you start going down that hole, man, what a life. I mean, what an interesting cat. And then, of course, Morrissey and Isbell and Lucinda and their influence on music and popular music, I mean, is just undeniable. And for you to have that access, now I'm kind of seeing it, that coupled with that upbringing of yours, plus your own talents and curiosity, it makes so much sense to me that your record sounds the way it does.
That is, I think you're the only person, including myself, who's been able to make sense of what the record is and just what you just said, because it's hard for me to even describe what's happening. I mean, I can talk about it musically, and that's about as far as I've gotten, but working through it with you today, it's kind of like, okay, it's pretty clear now what it is, and thankfully we've made sense of. It's taken me years to get to figure out what this is, but yeah, it's the Southern Gothic characters for millennials, which you have to factor in, disposable reality thanks to the internet and technology, and the rampant and available drug use that's just prevalent, and then with the kind of, certainly the Morrissey backing, and then my classical and just my sort of classical upbringing. That's where the music really is just the kind of classical. I like to rock, but I was like raised classical, so I've always been trying to like combine them. But that's what the whole record is, and I'm just so grateful that I had such a weird path. But I mean, talking to you now, it's like I had such a weird path. Of course, it's going to be a weird record.
Yeah. Well, I kept describing it to folks as a wild ride, right? I kept saying it's a wild ride. That's the only thing I could think of to say, because I was like, I don't know how to describe this. I don't, it's a wild ride. But now hearing all of this and getting to connect with you, like, it is the logical conclusion, or at least at this, of those experiences. It's the logical amalgamation of those experiences. Expression is the word I'm looking for here. Expression of those experiences and those relationships that you've had. And it all makes so much sense to me now. And for folks listening, if you haven't listened to the record, as soon as you end this podcast, I want you to go listen to the record, because I feel like that would be such a wonderful companion to this, more so than most conversations. I feel like, I mean, I've had the great fortune of having some wonderful guests, and I've always been proud of this work, but dude, yeah, this was something else. This is awesome. Thank you.
I got to give you a high five. I got to give you a virtual high five, because that's good journalism right there. I wasn't even really sure where. It's hard to talk about, but that really is what it is, and it kind of gives me a sense of relief, because it's just nice to know that I was able to turn all of those weird years into something. I almost said culpable, into something palpable. And I'm myself and people I know, we're sort of in the background as characters, and we're the characters that are being subjected to the treatment of that Morrissey backing, that Southern Gothic for millennials, that sort of just weird modern, that weird modernity that we're all just sort of enmeshed in. And it's hard to make sense of, but it's also fun and very easy to just partake of, the drugs and the internet. It's so prevalent, but it's hard to understand, and yet it's fun and convenient and cheap. And then I was finally able to. It was the first time I'd written on the piano in since I was a kid. So because I'd always written on the guitar, and so to sit at the piano, all those songs came out, and I was finally able to make the piano rock. So I finally, thanks to you, can figure out what this is.
That's awesome. I'm so
Well
glad.
done.
I'm so glad I could help provide that service. I feel like you
Thank
did all
you.
the heavy lifting, but I'm grateful that I'm getting credit here. Dude, this has been such a pleasure. We
It really
usually
has.
end it on what you're getting down on. So that's the art that has you inspired right now. Maybe a samba record that you've been listening to, or what, like a book you've been reading. Like, what are you fired up about right now? What kind of art has your attention?
Well, I've got the E.E. Cummings complete works from the
Mm,
Free Nashville Poetry Library. So that's my favorite spring, kind of early summer poetry to read. So I've been just enjoying just taking 20 minutes on 3 words in that and just poring over that. Listening to Demis Roussos, which I got on vinyl. That song, Forever and Ever, which is just a beautiful song. You'd probably enjoy that. It's unparalleled as far as vocal performances. And then I've also got Aznavour by Charles Aznavour, which is someone Morrissey turned me on to. And I never even, I mean, I'm just so grateful. You know, I mean, I make it sound like I feel more like I was a thief, you know, stealing all of all this wisdom in these places. But I guess I'm just grateful. You know, they turned me on to everything from Charles Aznavour to like Echo Belly or the New York Dolls. I mean, their musical acumen is so diverse. So yeah, Aznavour by Charles Aznavour, which I don't think there's a digital iteration of.
okay.
Not that I've been able to find on Spotify. And then yeah, E.E. Cummings. Perfect spring, late spring, early summer listening.
Where do you recommend starting with Demis Roussos?
Um, I would say, give me 2 seconds. I'll pull up. I've got the
Yeah,
vinyl sitting right here,
cool.
and the whole record is pretty psychedelic. Yeah, this record, I'll show it to you here. This record is really, really cool. And the titular track, Forever and Ever, side A, track 1, is just brilliant background vocals, a brilliant vocal performance from him. And he apparently was very popular everywhere but in America, which kind of like Charles Aznavour too. No one knows who he was, but I mean, these people were as big as Elvis if you look at coverage and if you look at airplay back then, which was huge, and then physical sales, which would have been, you know, vinyl records for both of them. And they're both just massive and they're incredible. And it's just so you can definitely sense there's a different cultural root than what we have here. And it's just nice to diversify. You know, everyone listens to so much music. It's like if you only drank one type of wine. It's like, I like Cabernet Sauvignon. Well, you can keep drinking the same bottle and keep enjoying it, but if all of a sudden someone hands you an orange wine or a really crisp, dry Riesling, all of a sudden, okay, well, I didn't know I was going to get challenged today. But that, you know, I try to diversify as much as I can. And music, it seems endless. And every time I take a break when the new music's kind of, I can't adhere to or find anything that to listen to, I go back and it's like there's still so much music to discover in the past.
Yeah.
Which is incredible.
I think that's one of the things, not necessarily with the point about the past, but one of the things that I'm really grateful for with the publicists that I've established relationships with is that, like, yes, if you look at the list of guests I've had, almost 90% of the musicians I've had fall into a broad Americana umbrella. But the publicists who know me, like Josh from All Eyes Media, shout out to Josh, like that, who's great and has been so good to the show. Folks like Josh know, like, he knew I was gonna like your record, for example, right? Like he knew it was an intentional. It was very clearly an intentional pitch that he knew I was gonna dig this, and that, you know, I guess you could technically call this Americana, but I don't know where you put this, and that's the beauty of it that we've discussed that for the last hour plus, is like how it's so nice to get access to those things because it's so easy with the algorithm to get stuck in a beautiful rut of just Jason Isbell sounding kind of, recordings. I'm not complaining about that. I don't, give me all the Ryan Bingham in the world. But at the same time, I have never heard of Demis Roussos until this moment, and I'm so stoked to dive into it. I'm with you, man, because with technology, as you touched on, it is so easy to get into a as much as it should open the world, it can also shrink your world so much. And I'm really grateful for conversations like this, and for folks like Josh, for example, who are, getting me into other things, the things that are outside of that sweet spot for me, or comfort zone,
Right. I think furthermore, I think as technology becomes even more, certainly more intelligent now, and certainly even more prevalent, for example, I mean, your refrigerator can be hooked up to your phone.
So wild.
Hooked up to your, you remote start your car. It's hooked up to your Netflix. I mean, it's kind of magical if you think about it that way. It's like a Ray Bradbury story, but at the same time, at what cost? And I know a lot of greater minds than mine are beginning to consider that, but as it pertains to art, for example, you would never find that Britney Spears fan page that I discovered in the early internet. It just doesn't, there's no place.
Yeah.
Because, more people, if you think about it, especially with emerging economies and emerging middle classes in like China, India, and elsewhere, Eastern Europe, more and more people are getting hooked up to the internet. People are going to just consume what's in front of them. Think about it. You're going to watch a movie. What are you going to watch? Well, it's going to be something on Netflix, or it's all, whatever it is, Hulu. It's going to be on one of these things. When you would go to, Blockbuster Video, you might walk out with the Toxic Avenger.
Yeah.
And that I don't know if that still exists. And with music, it's like the same thing. You're only going to get to consume what's trending. You're only going to get, but you're also imbibing the message. You're imbibing the worldview, and it's not getting more diverse. It's getting more and more sort of hyper focused on just a couple trending whatevers. And so I think we have a responsibility as users to diversify as much as we can, and to stay connected with each other outside of that in the real world, because that's going to be the thing that retains our sense of humanity and our sense of soul, because it's slowly ebbing away. I mean, just if you listen to the music that's trending right now, and then you listen to Demis Roussos and Charles Aznavour, they don't exist in the same universe, and that's a shame. That's a shame.
Dude, I remember you just took me to a very specific place in my life. I remember being at Blockbuster Video in Ocala, Florida, and this would have been my senior year in high school, where I'm really starting to try to get into things outside of my reality, outside of the country radio that I was raised on, and some of the and some of these things, and the cultural sort of norms that I was raised on. And I remember seeing the cover of Darren Aronofsky's film Pi. I remember seeing that and thinking that I'm drawn to this. I don't know the first thing about Darren Aronofsky. I want to say it was his first film. It's definitely the first one. Definitely the first one I'm aware of, So but I remember just seeing that, and then reading, the back, and being like, I'm going to give this a shot. And it just opening up so much for me in math and philosophy and religion and filmmaking and all these different things that film, and that experience happened because I'm walking around Blockbuster Video. Right. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the resurgence of vinyl. I mean, it is, and I'm really into CDs too. So like, I love like going through used CDs and finding somebody that I'm like, I'll take a $5 chance on this. Right. Like, even if, or that's an artist that I've been wanting to get into, I could dial it up on Pandora or Tidal or wherever, Spotify, but I'm not thinking about that when I open up my Pandora or Tidal or Spotify. I'm thinking about it because I see that physical copy right there in front of me. And that's one of the beautiful things about the resurgence of vinyl, and now even CDs to some extent, because it does, like, I picked up a Ramblin' Jack Elliott CD about a year ago, something like that. And I was like, this is one of those artists that I don't know the first thing about, that I should, quote unquote, know a lot about. Right. And that was my entry point. Right. I mean, because I otherwise wasn't it was somewhere deep in the recesses of my consciousness that Ramblin' Jack Elliott's somebody I need to dial up and get into.
That's cool. Yeah, and that's really intentional, and that was how it used to be the only way to do it, and there was a magic to that, and that's really cool that you've been able to preserve that. That's pretty inspiring. Yeah, and it's kind of leaving a little bit of room for that magic to guide you to something that, because let's face it, it's probably not going to come up, on Spotify in the same way that when you go to watch them, the things that are really popular now, and the things that are getting pushed to the consuming public, it's not Pi, it's not Darren Aronofsky necessarily. It's going to be, I mean, he just did The Whale, which was awesome, but
yeah, I loved it too.
It's going to be Spider-Man 8. It's going to be the next Marvel movie. Like, that's the stuff that's being mass consumed. But if people had, and it's simply because the algorithm has that level of control over people's habits.
Yeah.
People don't have the wherewithal, or maybe even the knowledge, or maybe the energy to go outside and say, I'm going to spend an hour at the thrift store going through CDs.
Yeah.
Magic happened. I'm going to go to a with vinyl, it's always been kind of a collectible thing. So there's that. And it's nice that that's becoming more widespread. But the discovery part goes away. And I'm very distrustful of how small the window is getting. Like if you Google anything, the results are so based on your buying habits. It's so based on your demographic. I mean, we're basically being digitally profiled by these people who want to sell us something. And as a result, the window of what the information that we're able to access, when people say, oh, the information, all of the information is accessible out there, thanks to the internet. Not really, because I mean, the way that we're accessing information, I mean, think about it. We're using Wikipedia, which is it's not very detailed information. It's not like reading a book. It's not like going to the library. It's not like having a conversation with someone, and the same applies to music and other forms of art. So and I think I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but I think what's happening, when you talk to people, it's dumbing down our sensibilities when it comes to art and when it comes to the diversity of art. And I think that's dangerous.
I 100% agree with everything you just said. And I think that, and of course, we're all trying to figure out how to navigate those waters, as we need, especially those of us who make stuff, right? We need the internet in order to promote that stuff. Speaking of which, is there vinyl for the new record? And do you have physical copies of various sorts that folks can buy?
Oh, let's see. So that's actually a really good point, because I never promoted anything and I never was going to put anything out. Thankfully, Cavity Search Records, shout out to them, came along, and he was someone, the president, Denny, and co-founder, he was someone that I'd been on his radar. He's been a fan. He's come to see me play in the Pacific Northwest. And just sort of as a labor of love, he has just sort of coaxed me out of my sort of self-imposed, retirement before even starting. But I never would have gotten online. I never would have put anything out if it wasn't for him. And then Jim and Josh at All Eyes Media, I was able to kind of approach those guys through Lucinda, because I was sitting next to Jim. You probably know Jim. He brought Josh onto All Eyes.
Yeah.
And he's an awesome guy. But I was sitting next to him at the Ryman for Lucinda Williams, and we got to talking, and that was how that happened. But I would never have put anything out. I never would have promoted it. I'm still terrible at it. I still don't know where I land on it. And you had a very good take on it, which is we're all trying to learn how to do that. And I think, we're trying to learn to do that in a way that is not too gross and is sustainable. I don't know how or what that looks like. I know some people kind of have it figured out. I think Jason does a pretty good job. Yeah. Jason Isbell, he does a pretty good job. He does his own socials. I think he's got a very good level-headed approach to what he does. I think it suits his music too, and it suits the mythology of who he is and what he does. For me, I'm still trying to figure it out. It's very new to me to be doing it at this level. So, but the label ordered some special edition box CDs. Tonight is actually the CD release show.
Right on.
Out for you. They can see. I never heard of anything like this. I have no idea what this even is, because we were talking about how a friend let me borrow the box set from the Smashing Pumpkins when I was 17, and it changed my life. And it was like, box sets. That's something there's not really a digital equivalent to. And he got to talking. So he kind of cooked this up. I don't really know what it is. It's a box, and it's the Violensia box. It's just the one CD, but then it's got this other art in it that's got like excerpts of the lyrics. And
cool.
You put it together and it forms. I haven't even you piece it all together. Anyway.
Oh, so cool.
That is a physical thing. Email me your address, or I'll gladly send you one if you'd like. I mean, if you have CDs,
I'd love that. Yeah.
Yeah, let me know. And then I just got the test pressing of the vinyl.
Okay.
And I was not prepared for what it sounds like on vinyl, because the loud, aggressive parts, which are like half of the record, sound really loud, really aggressive, really noisy, really in your face, so dissonant and discordant. I'm like, this is like a punk record. But then the softer moments are even softer and even more delicate, and the melodies are even more, I think, contrasted. So on vinyl, it takes on a whole new life. And I had a friend and I was telling someone else about this, because it's only like 30 minutes long. So, and it's just like you blast through and it's over, and you're like, what was that?
Yeah.
I turned it right back over because I was like, what just happened? I let her borrow I have 2 test pressings. She's got a killer rig down. She's actually down in Florida too. She's down in Santa Rosa, but she's got a killer setup. She's back from Europe. So she flipped it back. She's like, I had to flip it back over.
Oh, that's great, man. Well, I'm glad they did that. CavitySearchRecords.com. It looks like there's a few. You can get American Dreaming LP, it looks like, and then digital downloads of some of your other work, as well as a CD and LP of Violensia. Dude, this has been this is an all-timer, and
this is great, man.
I'm so grateful, man. I feel so my creative cup is full. Like, I want to go make stuff now. I want to sit down and write.
Me too. I'm feeling inspired also. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, have fun tonight. And
all right.
Dude, I'm sure we'll connect down the road as well.
I hope so. Thank you so much for doing what you do, and all the best as you transition careers and just keep living on this little rock in space.
Thanks, man. All right, I'll see you. Take care.
Bye.
The truth is I lied when I said I was fine. I'm so happy I think I might die. I'm so happy I think I might cry.
Jesse Daniel Edwards, y'all. Thank you so much, Jesse. Thank all of you for listening. JesseDanielEdwards.net for all things Jesse. CavitySearchRecords.com to get physical copies of the new record. The song you're hearing in this episode is I'm So Happy I Think I Might Cry from Violensia. Give it a spin. Get yourself a physical copy, y'all. MarinadePodcast.com for all things the Marinade. You can find written pieces, photography, our online store, and more. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Spoutable, and Twitter. Subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app. Tell a friend about the show. These are all free ways to support the Marinade. If you really like what we're doing and can swing it, please consider joining our Patreon community, y'all. Over on Patreon for just $2 a month, you can gain access to Patreon exclusive content like our show Jason's Journey, where I talk about the moments that shape my creative life and provide a window into the process of making the Marinade. Y'all, you can now try a free trial of Patreon to see if you like it. No pressure. Try for 7 days. Set a reminder on your phone in case you want to cancel, and then keep going if you dig it. We also have a monthly show called What We're Getting Down On, which is a conversation between me and my good friend Peter Haraldson, where we talk about the art that has us fired up at the moment. Our Patreon means so much to us. It's a deeper way to connect with these conversations. And then also things like me getting to go cover Bonnaroo just don't happen if not for our Patreon patrons. So thank you so much to our patrons. Y'all, if you want to support the show financially, but you don't want to commit to a monthly subscription, I totally get that too. You can Venmo or PayPal us at the Marinade, and all the money goes right back into the making of the show. Above all, we are just so thankful that you listen and you spread the word about the Marinade. Until next time, Go out and create something. Cheers, y'all.